good morning, afternoon, or evening, and welcome to the Bloody Disgusting Network. The following show is just horrifying. Beware.
My friendship to all of you precludes my involvement with any one of you. But if you wanna make love, then I do too, and I'll be right there behind you. All in the name of oh, all in the name of oh, all in the name of oh.
Hey everyone, Randall here, joined by Mike. Say hi, Mike.
Hi, Mike.
Today we're joined by one of my favorite podcasters, thinkers, writers, and streamers. His name is Matt Christman, and he is a co-host of the Chapo Trap House podcast, a New York Times bestselling author, and the voice of the Kush Vlog live stream, which my wife and I often listen to while we are cooking. Matt, say hello.
Hello.
We are
Thanks
very
for having
happy.
me.
Yes, of course. We're happy to have you here. So we talked to Will from Chapo, probably about 4 or 5 months ago, somewhere around there. And he mentioned
days before the King thing.
It was right around the same time. And and he had mentioned that you were a bigger Stephen King head than he was. So recommended that we get you on. So I'd love to hear a little bit about, like, before we talk about The Tower, I'd love to hear a little bit about your, like, King origin story. Like, how did you first stumble upon him? What was your first book?
I think my first book was Misery when I was in 5th grade. And we were all supposed to read a grown-up book and do a book report. And I did Misery. And as my book report, I dressed up like Annie Wilkes and I reenacted the foot removal scene with one of my classmates.
I love that. And
Yeah.
Were you a fan of, like, Stephen King straight away, or is that something that came later?
Oh no, it was like the way that he is able to paint a reality, like you read it and you are, it's cliche to say, but it's true, you are transported in a very specific way. I was gripped by, so I kind of binged into him. I read almost everything I could get my hands on by Stephen King. I was so, like, in the groove that I even ended up just accidentally reading like half a dozen Dean Koontz novels too, who is 100% the Aldi brand of Stephen King.
The Aldi, I love that. we always joke around with Aldi because I always feel like it looks like a set piece from, like, the movie Contagion at some point.
Yes,
because just like they're cardboard boxes that are on the shelves for some reason. I'm like, what is the deal here? Like, what are we doing? But anyway,
Yeah.
It's great. I love Aldi, and I'll stand by it. And Koontz, we'll see. I like Watchers, but are there any, like, early King King books that you read that really stood out to you as favorites, like post Misery?
The Stand. I read the extended edition of The Stand. That was
that was my
indelible.
first one. Yeah.
And the ones that really stuck with me, though, like are the deepest claws, even more than the Dark Tower, which came a little later, are the 70 short story collections.
Yeah.
That just nasty stuff, folks. That really just got embedded in me, things like The Jaunt and whatnot.
Yeah.
So that's the bedrock. And then when I was, I think, like 10, our family drove a minivan from Wisconsin to Orlando to go to Disney World. And I had the first 3 Dark Tower books with me, and I just read them on the car the whole way.
Oh, man.
So I just crammed it into my head. And then I was like, man, I can't wait for the next one. And then, of course, I had my before James R.R. Martin. I had my first encounter with getting blue balls from someone not completing a series that they were working on.
Absolutely. Yeah, I have some questions about that I'm going to ask you a little bit about later. But are you keeping up with King? Like, what's the last King book you read?
I have. I keep up. I read most of, like, the big ones. I read the Institute.
Yeah.
I generally don't read all the cop stuff, like the outsider stuff. I don't really read that. I read every single short story or novella collection because I think that's the strongest form.
Yeah.
I just finished If It Bleeds. I read that like a month ago.
Yeah.
And I am going to read Fairy Tale. I'm going to read that one for sure.
Yeah, we're working through that right now. We're doing an episode on it later this month, and it's really interesting because it's identifiably a Stephen King book, but it's so indebted to classic fairy tales rather than, I think, his like Dark Tower,
Right.
horror
Oh,
inflected
interesting.
version of them. Yeah, it's a lot more like about queens and kings and castles and things like that. But again, I'm
Well,
only halfway through it, so
um, the Eye of the Dragon is really
yeah.
good too. I read that as that was one of the ones I read.
Yeah,
And
this
I know
definitely
that
shares. Yeah, this
that
definitely.
is like not quite Middle East, or I'm sorry, Middle Age shit, but I think he does like courtly life very well, so I think it could be good.
Yeah. It's going to be an interesting one, and I guess I'm just really curious because since so many of his books incorporate other books and kind of the larger Dark Tower mythos, and this is about an alternate world. I'm sort of waiting on pins and needles to see if there's any tower lore that creeps into this, because again, I'm still only halfway through, so
Gotta keep an eye out for Man in Black. Any
know.
black clad people, please.
Well-
We got an APB out.
Yeah, it's such a strange book because it's like it starts off with not to spoil too much, but it like references his own movies. So you're kind of like, all right, well, we're not in the regular King's Dominion world. We're in some other like different alternate universe in a way. And then I'm hoping that there's a bridge here where when he goes into the fantasy land, that's maybe that's kind of the bridge world where we start getting into more mid-world stuff. But yeah, I mean, are you a dog? Do you like dogs? Are you a big fan of dogs?
I have dogs. I like dogs.
Yeah, you'll love. I feel like that's the easiest conduit into this book, even if you're not, because I'm not big on like a lot of the high fantasy stuff sometimes, but the stuff with the dogs, it's great.
Yeah,
I love a
basically
heckin'
story.
Pupperino.
It's basically a story of a boy and his dog, and I like to joke that he's sort of atoning for all the horrible dog deaths he's given us over the years. Yeah, we just did From a Buick 8, which has one of the most brutal and prolonged dog deaths in all of fiction. So, did you read a lot of horror fiction growing up? Like you said, you read Kuntz, you read King. Like, did you venture into other areas, or is horror like, I don't know, is it an important genre?
I
for you?
did. I had a horror phase. I was phased in and out. I would do lit for a while, and I would just only read about certain like Civil War, or
Right.
like I would read the Civil War or World War I or something, and then I would be like, I'm gonna read all of like the classic books you're supposed to read, and then like I'm gonna read like every James or Elmore Leonard book I could find. Like,
Yeah.
Oh, man.
so with King, it was like that led me to Kuntz, and then the classics, your Edgar Allan Poe's,
Mm-hmm.
and of course Lovecraft, because one of the books I read during this period was Dance Macabre,
Yeah.
which was, I think, is a really good book.
Yeah.
And
we
very,
reference it all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, a great like just like an example of how to like analyze culture, I think,
Mm-hmm.
like through the personal lens and all that. It works.
Yeah.
Did you just devour like the Elmore Leonard books? It's like, it's
Oh,
funny
yeah.
because I was ready to go into him, and then we started this podcast, and I was like, God damn it, it's going to be like 10 years before I get to his books. I'm dying to read them.
Yeah, I literally got to the point where I kind of got sick. I was in the middle of reading one of them, and I was like, you know what? This character is, I recognize him. He's the same guy who's been in the last 15 of these. And it's like, yeah, you're not supposed to read them that way, weirdo. So I put him away. But no, Leonard's awesome.
Love it.
Let's pop over to the tower. You said you read them on a family vacation on a long drive, and I guess like, were they later in your King development? And because I think for a lot of people, some people still don't even know about them because there hasn't really, I mean, at least prior to 2017, there wasn't like a film adaptation or anything. So were these books like surprises to you?
Well, by that point, I had my misery experience, so I was reading Stephen King books. I looked at him I knew that as like a brand I could trust.
Yeah.
And I saw The Gunslinger, and it intrigued me. So as it was just part of the natural progression of getting around to what I knew he'd put out, and it just pulled me in so quickly. The first book was perfect because like the first Gunslinger is such a like 70s like stoner, like post Tolkien weed head type book.
Yeah.
And it really has that like it smells like bong resin, the fucking and I was at an age where that was like there was enough cool elements to it, like killing all the fucking slow mutants and shit to keep me like gripped, but also kind of alien enough to keep me a little uncomfortable, because I maybe didn't the frame of reference was sort of going over my head as a little kid that made me like more interested into it. And so then I started reading A Drawing of the Three, and like the he started bringing our world into it and like balancing it out, then it became this thing that it was a world that I was pulled to. Like I never got into any of the high fantasy shit. Like I read the Hobbit because it was a school assignment in 6th grade. I never touched Lord of the Rings. This is my Lord of the Rings, really, is the Dark Tower for me, for sure.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I was like curious if you were a fantasy head and how you thought it might square with stuff like Wheel of Time and Golden Compass and Brandon Sanderson and all that kind of stuff.
I never read any. I read some Pierce Anthony when I was a little kid, but I never really got into the concept. I just sort of browse until I hit a vein, and then I would follow the vein. And so like this was sort of it. This ended up being like, oh, this is like in the Stephen Kingiverse. It was not part of like fantasy,
right?
The fact that like it spreads out into all these other books and is referenced in all these other books that aren't part of the same series, it does really make it feel like it's not really about a genre. It's about a guy. It's about a guy like mapping his own mind.
Yeah.
And then you going to live inside of it.
Do you remember the first time you encountered the tower, like outside the books proper? Like for me, it was Insomnia.
I remember reading Insomnia, and I remember my mind being fucking blown.
Same. Yeah.
When they're like, what? Roland?
Yeah, like,
I was like, that's the most amazing thing I've ever seen.
Yeah, I remember trolling message boards when I was young, because like in that sort of dead space, in between books, and everybody would talk about, like, theorize, like, what role is this kid from Insomnia going to play in Midworld and everything. Yep. And
another thing people got annoyed with when it actually happened.
Exactly. Yeah. It reminds me a lot of, I don't know, it's like, and this is something we can touch on later perhaps, but it just reminds me of so much multiversal storytelling that happens nowadays, now that it's very much in vogue. But a lot of the discussions are kind of the same. Like, when is, because now it's like, well, when is the X-Men going to show up in the MCU or whatever in this iteration of it? And back then I was like, when are the wandering boys from Eyes of the Dragon going to show up in, Song of Susanna or whatever, which is, it's interesting to sort of see that sort of message board culture become writ large on,
It's strange too, because like I remember in like the 90s that was like sort of a budding thing, because even in the 80s, just looking back at some of the sequels in that era, I mean, you get excited sometimes when the franchises reference their own sequels. Now it's like given at this point. And in the 90s, it kind of felt like you were sort of at that crossroads where that was starting to happen. Like, I mean, for me, growing up, a lot of these sort of like connections sort of happen on the playground. Like, you'd hear about things, like sometimes you'd be like really right. Like somebody would be like, this is in, this there's a reference to that and the connection's right. But then sometimes you get some idiot that come up and be like, did you know that, Jason Voorhees is Freddy Krueger's brother? And I'd be like, oh, okay. And then I'd go on with that fact because we didn't have the internet to check up on it. So I'd just be roaming around for years thinking that was fact. But I just remember.
That's not true?
No, it's not true, unfortunately. I swear to God, I went like 5 years thinking that was the thing. And then I just, whatever. I'm a shameful horror fan at age 8. But it just was such a unique thing to think of, the idea that these things could exist.
These worlds overlap,
and it's just, we take it for granted now at this point. But
yeah, like, Matt, do you remember that sort of, like stumbling upon a Dark Tower reference in another book, especially like once you got into the later books and so many of them became connected? Yeah. Was it exciting for you, or like to see all these connections with King's work, or did you hit a point where maybe it felt like oversaturation?
Well, I don't know. It felt like it reached a satisfying crescendo, because you had these first books come out in a relative regular interval. The Gunslinger is an early book. When is the Drawing of the Three release? Like the mid 80s. Yeah, and then Wasteland is in the 90s.
Yeah.
Then there's this big dry spell. Then you get Wizards and Glass, a fucking prequel that doesn't really advance the story much. Although at least it gets you out of fucking playing the mono, which is like, thank you fucking Christ. I've been waiting here with my fucking balls for 10 years to find out what happens with this goddamn train.
Yeah. Was it disappointing or exciting for you to like go back with Roland, or was it prequel?
Oh, I was pissed. I was pissed when it came out, but of course, once I started reading it, I didn't care, and I loved it by the end of it. But then that's just it. Then all of a sudden, it's like he knocked something out loose in the machine, and they all just get dumped out in one huge wordgasm. And so it makes sense that like that kind of psychic pulse would have a lot of knock-on effects and would end up like spilling out into everything else he was writing.
Yeah,
because, like he was finally like, all right, I'm gonna fucking like split the atom here, because he was stuck at the same place that all these guys are, like George R. R. Martin get, where it's you created such a giant evolving world that to like resolve it is to like resolve life, and how do you do that? And then he decided to take the plunge, and that's why I will respectfully stand for the later books, even though a lot of people hate them, because it was essentially an impossible task for the man who can't end things. It was the impossible task, and that it had an energy, I guess, that carries me through them anyway.
Yeah. You know, it's because by the time you get to those penultimate books and stuff, or especially like, you know, Song of Susanna or even Wolves of the Kala, you know, he's throwing in lightsabers, like things from Harry Potter. I mean, it's kind of like, I remember even reading it, just being like, all right, what's next? Like at this point, you're just, by the time,
and then he's a character.
Yeah.
To me, that's like, oh, that's great. Like if you read the first one, you're like, oh, the Doctor Doom and the Sneetches, what the fuck? Getting to the point where they literally made him as a character, it's like, okay, that makes sense. That's a progression.
Yeah.
From this thing, like you're getting pulled into the cultural like bricolage that makes up the dying mind of this fucking boomer. Who was also the guy who like built the world that you're living in.
It's funny that it starts with "Hey Jude," right? Like that's like the first.
That was the thing. Like when I first read
know?
the book, that's the thing that torqued me, because I was like, oh, this isn't some like this is Earth somehow. Also, how does this work?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I'm excited to revisit these books because, you know, when I first read them, I was dimly aware that, you know, Stephen King almost died in a car accident in 1999. And then he ended up writing that into the books, which, you know, I mean, I was aware of it, but now we've spent, you know, since we're moving chronologically, we spent a lot of time exploring what the post-accident books look like Dreamcatcher. Have you ever read that one?
Woo-hoo-hoo. I've read Dreamcatcher.
Yeah. I mean, that's a fucking...
door.
It's a fucking death dream, you know? It's like, and even when we talked to him, he referenced a little bit about like, you know, the bathroom is the scariest place when you get older, you know? And that's what Dreamcatcher was about, was like the things that come out of your ass are the things that are going to kill you these days, you know? And and so it's like, we've really been in this mindset of him grappling with not just the accident, but with 9/11. And I think because From a Buick 8, which is a book we just talked about, that book was written primarily in the aftermath of 9/11. And you can see a lot of like, I don't know, sadness and nihilism and, you know, the him reckoning with that question of like, what is evil and how do I deal with evil when it is so mundane but horrific. And so he's very much in this mindset where he's thinking about death all the time. And I feel like that's why he wrote these 3 books, like boom, boom, boom.
He had to get it out. He didn't want to leave it undone.
Yeah, he was, I think, worried he would die and it would be unfinished. Exactly. And he was also talking about retiring a lot around this time too. Like that whole near-death experience, like really, really, I think, scared the living shit out of him. And I think what I'm interested in is once we get to the end of these books, which I think King even thought might have been an ending for him in terms of publishing, his next book is Cell, which is like one of the most disposable, I think.
Yeah,
King books.
That's just like a thing he wrote on a cocktail napkin.
Yeah. It's probably not wrong, actually. He was having oysters in like in downtown. He's like by the Boston Common, just like, hey, what if everyone went crazy from their phone? And he just writes it down by the time the check comes. Yeah.
But that's the thing. You have that big, you know, Titanic, you know, dump. Then it's on the lighter fare. The other reason that I will always support the later books is, yes, they have this energy, and I think we're kind of identifying where that comes from, that pulls them along. And I do think that he's able to evoke like real consistent themes about, you know, the nature of creativity and how it relates to humanity and everything else. And then it ends in a way that I think is absolutely perfect. The ending of the book, the very ending, is in my mind the ideal ending, the best way to end it. It's like, to me, the Sopranos ending. If you didn't like it, you're wrong.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Do you remember like hitting that part where King jumps in and says, "Don't read the next bit. I
Yes,
preferred if
and
you
it's like
didn't."
it's so perfect because like he's trapped by the expectations of a popular audience, you know?
Mm-hmm.
It's like you cannot, this is actually like this is the truth behind the veil that they keep from the regular people.
Yeah.
That like this just keeps going on, because if you knew that, it would rob all of your petty bullshit life goals of any of their residents, and you wouldn't be a productive citizen anymore. So you've been conditioned to hate this fact. You've been
Yeah.
conditioned to be revolted by this knowledge, but it's true nonetheless. And if you want to know, you can keep going.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm like, you sort of touched on, I think, some of these ideas in it, like about creativity. And I think one thing that's so fascinating about King is it's impossible for him not to get kind of personal in his work. Unlike, I think, a lot of other contemporary fiction writers, like Michael Crichton, you don't read his books and think, I'm seeing
except for later on when all of his like crank politics started seeping through. But the early ones, not so much.
Yeah, see, that's the different. Crichton was sort of my way into, I think, quote unquote, adult fiction. Like I had a similar assignment in school. It was like, read a grown up book and write about it. And for me, it was Sphere by Michael Crichton, which remains a book I adore. Oh, what's up, Mike?
I feel like Crichton became like the Dennis Miller of fiction podcast, fiction writers. It's like at one point we're like, we were kind of with you for a bit, and then all of a sudden you're just like off the deep end. We're like, all right, you've gone too far. I can't go there. Still love Jurassic Park though. Although I don't know what I would reference for Dennis Miller than Weekend Update, but yeah.
But yeah, it's like, but Crichton, you never feel like you're like encountering him necessarily. Whereas King, or like same with like Tom Clancy or these guys who write a lot of the procedurals and the guys.
Oh, I read Tom Clancy too. That was yes, I was all about him.
Yeah, and that's who King, I think, like the most we've seen of his kind of professional bitterness. A lot of it is aimed at Tom Clancy. He was always mad that Tom Clancy sold more books than him. But I think
hey, learn how to describe the missile systems on a fucking U.S. aircraft carrier, okay?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the thing though about King's work, and it's one of the things that I think is shocking that he's so prolific. Or maybe it makes sense because he writes from the hip so often, and a lot of it really does become about where he's at in his life at that time. And that's why I think our podcast like has kind of evolved into this study of one man sort of chronicling his various crises through fiction. And The Tower, I think, like, I haven't reread these books in quite a long time, but once he writes himself in to the story, what I remember so vividly is what an asshole he makes himself. And when you mentioned the whole idea of him being this boomer who's kind of looking backwards, that's something we've talked about a lot too, because have you read Hearts in Atlantis?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, see, Hearts in Atlantis is a fascinating portrait of a guy who's reckoning with his generation having failed to change anything in the world.
Yep. Swing and a miss.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's something he carries with him in a lot of his books, is the idea that the world is getting demonstrably worse and it's
moving on, baby.
It's moving on. Exactly. And that's what I was going to say about the Dark Tower books, is I think that's one of the themes that has always captivated me. Like, I remember in Wizard and Glass, we see the old oil tankers that are essentially ancient, artifacts, these Exxon tankers that have been out of use for so long. And it's so interesting to think about this being a world that isn't that different from ours, but has, moved on. And so I think that King's often considered, I mean, look at The Stand for a good example, that sort of humanity's restless desire for progress will sort of be its own undoing. Like, do you think that's a theme that resonates in the Dark Tower books?
Oh yeah, no, fucking Northwest Positronics.
Yeah,
the idea of the Crimson King, like the abstract evil of it is so fascinating to me, because it really is coded as an algorithm of destruction, basically. Like the Crimson King is at the end of the book this like very deflating, disappointing buffoon, because at the end the human what do you call it? The people connected to the machine, right? At the top of it, even they're not vital to its function. They're just there to be driven mad by it, basically.
Yeah.
And then like to serve its will. But it's just this, it's this entropic drive to destroy that is manifest in the machines that are built.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's so. I'm glad you brought up the Crimson King, because I know one complaint a lot of people have is that we spend so many decades reading about Randall Flagg, and he emerges as an antagonist in this world, and then he is dispatched in such quick fashion in book 7, and some people are disappointed because they're like, I wanted him to be the big bad, not the Crimson King. How do you feel about like the sort of Flagg versus King sort of dynamic?
Well, I think the king had to be a letdown, a deflation, because the figurehead, the embodiment of any like current like that is always hollowed out by it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
They do not have anything within themselves. Like so you're left with just this guy who got right to the edge of the machine that he was trying to destroy for his own mad reasons, and in the course of it just turned into a like a Atari games big boss.
Well, that's we always joke that's like Super Mario 2 with like the thing that comes.
But once again, boomers. Okay,
Yeah.
this is all the architecture of the mind of a dying American a subject of like the high modernist American idea, like when the mind really could be unbounded, and imagination could truly extend everywhere.
Yeah.
That we no longer have.
Right. I do think that's so interesting to consider, sort of the king being this mad screeching thing at the end. It's kind of it fits perfectly, I think, with King's general idea of evil. There is a description I read, which is that evil within King's world is powerful but stupid.
Yeah.
It's like even the Institute, which you mentioned you read, like this is this institute that is harnessing all this power and has these these global dominant sort of goals and all this other stuff, but the building's cameras are like super old and they don't fucking clean the hallways. It's like they have all this power and they can control all these people, but they can't run a broom down the hall. Like they're just complete idiots.
I guess with the Randall Flagg thing though, it is. I mean, I guess we could spoil shit, right? I mean, it's
we're
just putting on the thing. All right, yeah. So I mean, I do think it is kind of disappointing that like he gets dispatched so easily. I guess there's an irony to it that he continues to keep pervading through all the books, and then all of a sudden he's just eaten by a fucking spider or whatever. But like, I don't know. I mean, what did you think about that? I mean, we talked a little bit about Crimson King, but in terms of Flagg's demise, did you want something more from him, or do you think it was fine? That was kind of like a bah.
That's probably the weakest part, I would say.
Yeah.
The whole Mordred Flagg thing. And again, you can't have a large scale Stephen King project and not have some sort of failed thread, something to fit one of the fireworks failing to go off in the big finale. Like that's part of his charm, honestly.
Yeah. That's one of the things why I always say Needful Things is one of the best books, even though most people don't love it.
Oh God, I love that ending.
Every fucking thread pays off in that book. That is one of the most elegantly, perfectly constructed Stephen King books. And it's also a comedy, which he told us in our interviews. He's very mad people don't understand that that's a comedy.
No, yeah, Needful Things is hilarious. The fucking movie's even kind of funny.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun with the movie when we revisited it. We watched.
Ed Harris is on so much cocaine in that movie. It's fucking unreal. I mean, like in the first 5 minutes, he's just already on like on 11.
Everybody is fucking screaming.
They go nuts. He's like, yeah, exactly. It's fucking crazy.
Well, we always quote in the trailer, like which we use as a bumper sometimes, like Harris being like, "Don't you see what you've done?" Like it's so good. But yeah,
melting words together.
Max von Sydow goated in that.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you feel it's too warm in here, give the word. I have a tendency to turn up the heat.
Yeah, I guess like we're talking about villains. Like, what makes a good King villain for you? Like Leland Gaunt. Like we're talking about Max von Sydow, who is one of my favorites. And then obviously Randall Flagg. You've got you've got Pennywise. Like all these different villains. Like, what are the villains that I don't know? Like, or I guess like, are there threads that connect King villains to you, or is there one that stands out as one you enjoy?
Well, I love his small town tyrants.
Yeah,
big fan
like
of the small town tyrant.
Yeah.
That was one of my favorite parts of Under the Dome.
Yeah.
The Rennie family.
He's such a shithead.
Yeah, easily
Yeah.
one of the most hateable characters in all of King. Although I'm more partial to Junior because I like King's bullies and psychos.
Oh
Like
yes,
Henry.
also another example of one of his finest archetypes, the thuggish, dim-witted bully.
Yeah, I talk about it on our episodes quite a bit. Henry Bowers from It is like my favorite character in all of King because he's just I love the sort of patsy characters, the ones who are
Schmucks.
they're so
Schmucks.
rotten. Yeah, they're so rotten that they become these perfect vessels for whatever supernatural entity like sort of is hovering. I think King writes those archetypes so well. Like when we're talking about archetypes too, like what stands out in King as something archetypal that I don't know, maybe you associate with him when it pops up in other stories, or I don't know, like, and I guess in the larger realm, like what are things that are decidedly Kingian that you see pop up in, I don't know, modern fare?
Well, I mean, obviously, if anyone saw Stranger Things, that's just like a straight ripoff of his entire vibe.
Yeah.
Like his entire deal is just wholesale ripped off by those no talent Duffer Brothers.
Oh man.
What's your beef with Stranger Things?
It's a limp pastiche. It's like, look at, don't you remember remember the cool stuff that used to make you feel good? Here's its most vapid expression. Like, oh yeah, this is like Stand By Me.
It's like a lot of things.
No, I'd say like kids together, working together,
Mhm.
and being oppressed by awful parents.
Yeah.
Small town tyranny.
Yeah, absolutely.
People, the classic person who snaps. And he's also very good on he does the two personality thing pretty good.
Yeah.
Secret Window and
Yep.
the Dark Half.
Classics. We love those around here. Well, maybe not
What
Secret
about
Window, but
what about his dramatic stuff? Because I mean, one of the biggest, I mean, I guess it's not really a hot take for us, but what we've learned over the last 5 years is just that his strongest flex is when he's kind of going for the tears, like when he's actually kind of building up either a love story or when he's actually trying to build up like, just a story about friendships that's going to hit you at the heart. Like,
I like the
is
Green
that stuff
Mile,
that like, do you ever gravitate
Oh
towards
yeah,
those works?
Green Mile. I read that in like the serial format. Like,
Yeah.
in the individual. I would go and buy them every month when they came out.
So you've been in the waiting room for a lot of his books then.
Yeah.
With Dark Tower, Green Mile, were you like kind of championing at the bit for the next, book of the Green Mile, or were you kind of like halfway through, you're like, all right, we need to wrap this up?
I didn't really love the Green Mile. It was a little sappy.
It's a little sappy, yeah.
Tower wise, when did it peak for you? What's your favorite Tower book?
I think the one where it all really clicked into pieces, although my friend who just I have a friend who's I was talking to that don't like this one. Drawing of the Three. Oh no, is it Wasteland? It's either Drawing of the Three or Wasteland. I think maybe the Wasteland.
I love the Wasteland. It's for me, it's like so many good characters. I love Blaine the Mono. I love TikTok Man.
We love the TikTok Man, don't we, folks? The TikTok Man. He's so big. He's such a big guy. He's got a big clock. He knows what time it is, folks. The TikTok Man.
It's such a perfect role for like John Cena.
Yes.
And it's such a bummer that like every adaptation has crashed and burned. And yeah, so I guess I'm curious, did you see the 2017 movie?
PU. That's stank. I went with a friend who was another King head, and we were in the theater, and he said afterwards that he could just look over at me, and every 5 minutes or so, I would just go, "Pah!" Like, what?
But
I would just reflexively scoff at what I was seeing on screen. Just the most dumbed down, nitwitted garbage I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah, it's so frustrating. Like to try to, and as much as they kind of gave a lot of lip service to, and there was so many talks about like, well, how do we adapt this? Like Ron Howard was saying, we're going to do movies and we're going to do TV series and it's going to be a huge sprawling thing. And then of course it sifts through so many people's fingers and it ends up and we get this one movie that is barely even trying to establish, I think a larger universe because it reminds, did you ever see the Dark is Rising movie? Susan Cooper from back in like the mid 2000s.
Dark is Rising. What's that?
Oh, it's a book series by Susan Cooper. I loved it when I was young, but they adapted it and made like the most, piece of shit like thing ever, because it's this like huge sprawling world and they realize they fucked up like halfway through, so they just put a definitive ending on it and basically just said we're not even going to try this because this is such a failure. And I think that's so much of what I see in the Dark Tower movie, which is this movie that tried so hard to be like every other like YA movie out. And
yeah, they decided to make it some fucking Perry Jackson, the fucking Olympian bullshit. It's like, exactly. I'm sorry, like this is a little more, it's a little headier than that, man. This isn't written, this was not young adult fiction. This is for grown-ups.
Exactly. I think that's so true. Like, so I guess my question, if you wanted to see is that something you would want to see as like a cinematic version of the Dark Tower? Or do you think it's kind of unadaptable?
I know, I think it could have been a series, and apparently it was going to be a series on Amazon, and they killed it, and I bet that it ended up getting killed because they were either going to be able to afford that or this fucking Lord of the Rings bullshit. And because Bezor is a fucking Tolkien dork, that's the one that they have. It's all personally just him deciding, oh, I want to see that because I like this elf bullshit. More proof that these guys suck, because if he had better taste, he would have put all that money behind a fucking Dark Tower series.
Yeah, the pilot's great too. We managed to be able to see a screening of it, and it's so depressing because it's like a Pandora's box situation. It's like you open it and you're like, well, you're never going to see the rest of it, and now you have this what if in your head for the rest of your life. And it's like it's pretty dead on with it. I mean, they pretty much were going for like the Wizard and Glass start, with kind of mixing in with a little bit of the mixture of the gunslinger, and you could just tell like, this is going to work.
So they're starting chronologically for early.
Yeah.
They're not going media res.
Yeah, and you've got Michael Rooker as Eldred Jonas, like perfect casting. It really had a lot going for it, and it's too bad that it's not happening. But yeah, let's I guess adaptation wise, do you look forward to Stephen King adaptations these days, or do you think the boat has sailed?
What I want is new adaptations. What is frustrating to me is that it seems like all we're getting are remakes of things that have already been adapted, usually by much better filmmakers.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like they're doing Christine again. They just did Firestarter again. Do some shit that has not been adapted. There's plenty of it.
Well, the good news is you said you read If It Bleeds, right? And Mr. Harrigan's Phone is getting an adaptation only 2 years later. I mean, it is kind of wild to think that a story that's been in the ether or been in existence for like 2 years already has a movie, and yet. And also,
I'm sorry, if you've read If It Bleeds, that story is like some fucking old man. That's some like rest home mush right there.
Yeah. Well, the director of The Blind Side's doing it, so it'll definitely go well.
Is this the old man's haunted phone?
Yeah,
I know it is such
like a creep show segment.
Exactly. Maybe a creep show segment.
Like just pondering over like the technology of the youths. And if there's one thing I appreciate about Fairy Tale, it's that the main character is 17 years old, and King basically just comes up with enough different reasons to write him as if he were like a 75-year-old man, because he grew up like only watching TCM, and all of his music references are all like from the 50s and 60s. So he literally
that's not too outrageous, because when I was a kid, we had cable and we had Nickelodeon, and I watched some Nickelodeon, but I watched way more Nick at Night.
Yeah.
So I had a lot of mid-century ass references when I was a kid.
That's true. I
knew the Patty Duke show theme.
Oh yeah. I knew I was obsessed with Dobie Gillis for a while when I was young.
I remember dressing up as Fonzie, I think, for Halloween once, and everyone at school was like, "Oh, what is this, like Grease or something?" I was like, "No, it's Happy Days," and they were like, "What the fuck is Happy Days?" And I was just like so disappointed. I was like, "How do you guys not know this show?" I was so angry, but anyway.
Matt, I love your sort of insight into how things evolve. Like, I mean, obviously you're a student of history. I think you think a lot about how certain events shape and cause certain things to evolve. And so I guess I'm curious on your take on sort of the evolution of King as a cultural figure. Like, what did his name mean to you when you were young, and how would you say that changed over the years?
Well, when I was a kid, he was the master of horror. He was like a hegemonic cultural figure, and he stood in for an entire world. And like I said, I kind of just lived in its umbrella for a while. And I would go and read other guys like Michael Crichton. I read
Yeah.
a couple of those. Read a fair number of Tom Clancy's, and I said some Coons, but none of them really grabbed me the same way. None of them got me coming back. And so he's the only one who, as he's continued writing, I've continued following him. So he took a turn when I was like in my late teens, when he was writing for the Entertainment Weekly, kind of.
Yeah.
When he just kind of turned into like America's like affable grandpa or like uncle or something, like, hey, it's Uncle Steve, guys, how you doing? And it was like, oh, he's not scary anymore. He's not spooky. He's just a guy.
Have you seen his Twitter
It's like,
account?
did you watch Sons of Anarchy this week? It's
Oh,
great.
yeah.
I was gonna
It's
say,
like, you know what? The books have a different feeling to them now because I know that you were like this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like one of the things I think we struggle with sometimes is we wish, like, if there's a reason, there's many reasons to wish against social media, but it's like when I read King's Twitter account and it's just him talking about like Blacklist episodes and how much he loved the latest I don't know, like spy thriller from some author who
he liked Heat too, so I give him credit for that. That was
well,
pretty
it's just
cool,
kind of
but
like sometimes you're like, I never wanted to know this much about your life, and unfortunately you can just unfollow, but we have to because we have this podcast.
It does show that you live in a more impoverished world where you have this sort of intimate connection to artists. They're supposed to be at a remove. It's part of the magic.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, is that something that you miss just even beyond Stephen King? I mean, that's just something that the lack of mystery,
just a general dissolve towards this like kind of wretched familiarity.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, like I think I think Stephen King, the celebrity, like Stephen King, the cultural figure, is fascinating to me. I mean, this is somebody who, in the 80s and 90s, he was ubiquitous. He was publishing books. He directed, Maximum Overdrive. Did American Express.
Did he ever direct that movie?
He did American Express commercials. Like, he had a band. I mean, and he was on every talk show imaginable. Like, he was a celebrity beyond just a famous author. He would act in movies. Like, do you think we'll ever have
that's over. That position in culture is no longer available.
Yeah, why do you think that?
I mean, it's just the technological trend. There's nobody reads.
Yeah,
like in the short of it, it's nobody reads, and that's because we have created a media culture that requires a greater and greater degree of stimulation at all times than books can provide.
Mm-hmm.
Like they are now obsolete for the kind of brains we're creating by constant media stimuli. So you can't have a bunch of people reading books and then like having someone with that kind of direct control over like the real estate of their imagination being one person. It ends up shattering into a kaleidoscopic array of subcultural and lower overhead media ventures that everyone engages in as the system kind of turns into just this big vertically integrated monopoly of social media and legacy, like loss leading media that will slowly go away until we're only entertaining each other.
Yeah. I mean, it's I think a large part of it. I was thinking about a lot of this. What was the award show that was this week? Was the Emmys?
Yeah.
I was just thinking a lot about like just the whole stan culture and just how like we've personified these celebrities' wins as like these own victories that because we can get the endorphin kick of like being able to retweet it or like it, and that we don't really even like consider the feats anymore. And I think that's kind of one of the reasons why we don't get like a King or even just a regular celebrity, or maybe why Hollywood can't be run by, have celebrity like led films anymore, is because like feats and accomplishments, I just feel like they just don't matter anymore. It's just like whatever you can that's exactly that monoculture that you were just talking about. It's that like, if that's trending, what does it matter if they're really good in a fucking movie? Like, it just doesn't matter anymore. I mean, maybe that's me just being cynical, but that's kind of where I've landed at the last few years. Is just that, as long as something's trending, it doesn't really matter why. And you just kind of go with it. And I don't know, it's kind of depressing. That's a little maybe too cynical, but
no, I love it. I also think like King is so interesting because he is the IP, right? Like, and we live in this IP driven culture. We live in this culture where, movie stars don't sell films anymore. IP does. And Stephen King is somebody who has been some version of that like throughout his entire life. And I guess I'm curious, Matt, like why do you think Stephen King sort of had this big resurgence in a lot of ways over the past 5 to 6 years? Like, is there something appealing or nostalgic about a presence like him in, in the, post 2016, I guess?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's a generation looking backward to the comforts of their youth, and Stephen King was one of those.
Yeah.
And so that's part of it. But also there's just the perpetual grinding acquisition and regurgitation of existing intellectual property, because it's that thing. It's the ownership of the intellectual property. That's the rent that is being sought by every element of the film industry. And so there is essentially now a limited amount of IP, because no new IP can be have the same value. It's Confederate money basically compared to old IP. And Stephen King has a big chunk of our collective old IP, so he's going to come back one way or the other. But I think he's specifically coming back as this return of like the Gen X millennial childhood.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I wrote a piece back in maybe 2017 or so for the outline about about like the generation that grew up on Stephen King are the ones who are making the movies now. And at the time I was pretty optimistic because I thought the Gerald's Game adaptation was really strong. I thought the first It had good moments, and I really like 1922. Have you seen 1922 with Thomas Jane?
Yes.
Yeah, we really like that one here because, again, it's an original story. It's told well. It's simple, low budget. And it's so hard to get stuff like that now. But sadly, it's like the same sort of thing that happened in the 80s and the 90s where the IP becomes so diluted that the works just begin to fall off. And I do think the mark of that these days is not doing originals, like making Pet Sematary again and making it worse, and making I don't know. I'm trying to think of the other remakes. Oh, Firestarter again,
because
and
it's
making
so
it
easy.
worse.
It's just so easy to do. I mean, it's the low hanging fruit. I mean, that kind of goes with what you were saying earlier, Matt. It was just like inevitably that's what they would do, right? Because it's just kind of like, it's the easiest way to slap on that IP and just kind of juice it for what it is. I mean, it's sometimes I see things getting greenlit, and I'm just like, where's the end game here? Like, do you really think that this is gonna have some sort of some lasting measure here? I mean, like. And that's all that could go through my head during the D23 Expo that was last weekend. It was just like project after project being announced, and it's all just taking one thing of IP and just juicing it. And
Did you guys see the thing?
It.
Did you guys see the unveiling of the next Disney movie, the next Disney cartoon movie?
The one with the Wish Upon a Star thing?
Yeah.
Like
the star that all you ever wonder how the star that all of your Disney heroes wished on. No, I did not.
Yeah,
that's ridiculous. Why would I wonder that?
We've bottomed out at this point. Like,
first of all, I only think there's like 2 Disney movies where they wish on the star, right? Like Pinocchio and Cinderella. I think so. Who else wishes on the star? That's 2.
Can't think of any others.
No stars in Bambi, I don't think.
That movie is like 2 hours of like a time lapse of an expanding nebula. Like some fucking like actual star being like forged out of stellar dust. Put that shit on IMAX. I will take edibles and see it. But if it's like about some chirpy little, how are you supposed to anthropomorphize a fucking star? Or like, is it a human who like dies and becomes a star? What the shit?
So you said you want more. Wait, what were you going to say, Mike?
Well, I was just saying, like, your idea of the IMAX movie, it would be great. I'm just imagining Disney releasing, like, what was that movie in the 80s, that trilogy, like Koyaanisqatsi?
Koyaanisqatsi.
Yeah. Like, if Disney did that, like, that's their new blockbuster coming out. It's like, we're going to bring this on actually Christmas Eve.
This reminds me of another infuriating thing that they did. So that Lightyear movie came out. Yeah. And I know everyone tried to turn it into a fucking culture war thing. And it was in everyone's interest for that to happen, but I think people just like they didn't get it. The concept was confusing, and they kept insisting Buzz Lightyear is this toy from a movie that Andy really loved, and this is that movie. Here, we're going to show you this movie that inspired his love of movies, and your, as the audience's love of movies, please come back to the movies. That's the subtext of that movie. But here's the thing. I saw fucking Toy Story. If you've seen Toy Story, you know that there's a diegetic use of a of it, there's a commercial that is shown on television for the Buzz Lightyear doll, and there is no mention of any fucking movie. It's not shown that this is like, hey, did you like this movie? Well, there's the character from the movie. It's like a commercial. It was like a Stretch Armstrong commercial where they're like, here's a doll who does stuff. He is an action figure. Here's what he can do. There's no reference to a fucking film. They fucking made that entire bullshit up.
Well, now they're doing an It prequel called Welcome to Derry, and I think that's how
criminy. What?
Yeah,
I know. It never ends.
I think that's kind of where I think that's our wish upon a star kind of thing, is like, didn't you want to know where Pennywise came from? And it's like,
Come
no.
on.
Like, we get that glimpse in It of whatever, the fire in the sky that comes down. That's all I fucking need to know about the arrival of It.
I love when King talked about it, and you just kind of get the sense that it was very Larry David about it. He was like, yeah, this could be an interesting idea or whatever. It's like you couldn't even feign excitement for it. Like, just could give a shit about that fucking series.
Oh, did you see they were also going to do a fucking prequel to The Shining about the Overlook Hotel?
Yeah, that's been scrapped.
What happened at the Overlook with do you get confused when peekaboo happens because I don't know where you go?
I know, though, it is interesting, though, to watch Hollywood sort of bend themselves in pretzels, trying to take the most notable King IP and build, levels on top of it or below it or to the side.
The Shining universe. That's just it. These are like competing archipelagos of IP. It's like fucking Universal Universalis or Europa Universalis or whatever you call it. Like you're trying to build like your merchant network of IP, and that means extending franchises out and bracketing them off. Like the business model was created like in the post 2008 entertainment industry. This is how it works. You need to pool things together in these massive concentrations of speculative IP that can be leveraged. And that's like everything has to be an extended universe. So we're going to get a Stephen King extended universe. So we're going to get a thing about the origins of what before Christine was a car when it was a buggy.
It's just a guy in a car. It's just like a normal nuclear family just living with this car. That'd be great.
So if there was an original book that hasn't been or original movie of a book that hasn't been adapted, what would you like to see?
This is a good question. I've thought about this.
Yeah.
I really liked yes, I got it. I know it's clear. You know what? No, never mind. Damn it. There's so many of them.
Yeah, like for us, we always talk about how awesome the Jaunt would be.
Yeah,
like,
but how do you make a movie out of that?
Right.
Yeah.
I feel like it could be a good creep show segment. Or
yeah, exactly. You should bring back the anthology for fuck's sake. Bring back the thing is now anthologies are considered streaming bullshit, like the fucking creep show show, which is like, it's very janky. If you've seen it, it's cheesy.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of the charm and it's kind of fun, but it's like, it's more than anything, it's cheesed up.
Yeah. And not in the way, I don't know, like for me, I couldn't get into it because it's not the kind of cheese of the original Creepshow where it's more indebted to like Tales from the Crypt and like those old kind of 50s comics that are so gruesome, but also so like darkly, blackly funny.
That's the thing is that it's nastier. That's why I don't like the Sappy King, because although I think when he hits a sweet spot, it's really powerful. Yeah. But his best side is his nasty side.
I agree.
That's the side he's wrestling with all the time. That's the side that like writes on his shoulder, that lives on his shoulder. The Dark King. Yeah. The fucking the Howard Stark or whatever his name is.
Will had a theory on our conversation that, and maybe he pulled it from you. Actually, I can't remember. But he said that because the Red Sox won, that's when he became soft.
That's possible. That could have totally taken a wind out.
And that's also
why he getting hit by a van.
Yeah. I think honestly, like we're in that phase now. Like I think he's wrapped up in this sort of like weird nihilism, weird obsession with death. But I think he comes out on the other end of that. Like I think Lisi's story. Yeah, I think Lisi's story is probably that way out of it. And and into the more cuddly king. But there is occasionally a great flash of darkness. Like Revival is a great Latter-day King book. Like Under the Dome has a lot of great Cocaine King like madness.
Oh yeah, I've got some real Tommy Knocker vibes from that one.
Yes,
Oh,
exactly.
absolutely.
And I love that. I love his ensemble stuff. But like, and he, when we interviewed him, he teased a sequel to Cujo called Rattlesnakes, and he kept calling that really nasty. And he said it's very transgressive, is like how he was describing it. And I'm so excited to read it because I'm like, is 70-some-year-old King transgressive? Is it the same way that his early stuff was, or has like his idea of what is transgressive, like has it softened so much,
Well, and that's kind of like the funny irony about it all is that like, growing up, I mean, I was always kind of under the assumption that like the older the man, the more meaner they are. And so it's not like, I figured like you'd kind of be the opposite. Like, at this point you'd be like, his main character would be like shot in the head, like in the like page 30. And then, and then maybe like at the end, the whole world just melts or something. I don't know. Just growing up, that was like, it was never the assumption that, oh yeah, the 75-year-old man's gonna be a nice guy. Like, it's just not how I was raised, I guess. But I don't know. It seems weird that that's kind of where it's been at this point. But
he's a very blessed, happy man these days, I think, which isn't necessarily conducive. I mean, that's something like, as we wrap up here, like something I think I've been longing for is the paranoia of early King. There was so much anger and so much distrust. Like if you read Firestarter, if you read The Stand, like he was very critical of culture. He was very critical of government. He was very critical of institutions. And I think that's what I've missed most, because modern King, he's the ultimate, Biden supporter, like online.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And he's
lost
kind
the
of
fire, like fucking Running Man, for Christ's sake. That book is astounding and incredibly prescient.
Yeah, like even like the Institute, I wanted him to go further. Like if this was written in the late 70s or early 80s, like it would have gone I think a lot harder on the idea that this is sort of a government sanctioned program. Like he didn't make it the shop like he did in Firestarter. He wanted it to be this individual thing, because I think he is a lot more hesitant these days to sort of criticize bigger institutions, because I think, he is that ultimate boomer who it all worked out pretty well for him,
Yeah, like he thinks he needs those institutions to stop Trump.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
he can't really undermine them.
I know, and that's such
the
a
trap
bummer.
all the liberals are in. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, because it's like, there's no criticizing the left anymore, or the the actual, like the Nancy Pelosi's of the world, because we've got to stop Trump. And it's like, so, and now you've read some of his later books, like he's talking about Hillary Clinton and the Institute. If you read Billy Summers, he's talking about Donald Trump. If you read later, he's talking about Donald Trump. It's like unfortunate. He just can't really divorce that personal side of him from his work. And it's something that I think but he's always been like attuned to pop culture in all of his work. It's just, now it manifests in the most insufferable way possible.
I've thought about a lot of this, especially after we read Hearts in Atlantis, and I kept thinking about my my uncle, who, he was a boomer, but somewhere in the 90s, he kind of went the same route that Carlin was in at the time, where it was just, the mistrust of any institution, of any party, was just gone. It was just absolutely gone. And this is a guy that was like burning our OTC buildings down probably, but like I just at that point there it was that guy who was just subscribing to all the different all these different like places, and just absolutely railing against the whole voting party system and everything. But then you get my dad, who's also a boomer, and then switch parties totally. I mean, and then so I do wonder if there's a what if situation with King, where he became more of the fuck everything. I'm, in that, which is kind of where I think a lot of liberals are at this point right now. I mean, at least some of them are. I mean, I'm certainly not, going on.
Everybody is somewhere in the stages of grief.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because we have all come to 2020 was the death of the young end of the Democratic coalition's belief in the systems.
Yeah.
And like this Biden administration is the death of the belief in it in the older ones, like, because they're finally saying like, oh yeah, everything that I told myself to support this party is a lie. Like they were supposed to stop Roe versus Wade from getting overturned. They can't do it. Like that they can't they can't protect us, but there's no alternative. So there's nothing to do but like
Yeah.
rend our garments because we can't move on because we can't accept what's happening because we're so scared that in the absence of change, something bad's going to happen. It's like, yeah, it already is.
Yeah.
We got to do something.
Yeah. As we wrap up here, our listeners love recommendations. I'm curious if you have any horror like movies, books, anything you've read or engaged with lately in the horror world. Like, what is it that is working for you these days in terms of, I don't know, newish horror?
I hadn't read any horror in a while. And then I read this guy. I think he's Canadian. And he's very pulpy. Nick Cutter. Has anyone read this guy?
Yeah.
We love The Troop on this podcast.
The Troop I thought was really good. I read a few others of his that weren't as good as The Troop, but they were all, I was glad I read them.
Yeah, I like The Deep a lot. Little Heaven I struggled with quite a bit. But.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. That honestly feels like 80s Cocaine King, like to the max, like off the rails.
Yeah, it's got a lot of It vibes, but it just doesn't work for me in the same way. But The Troop is one of the most gruesome, like transgressive kind of nasty books I've read, and it's so hard to find that nowadays. Like, we have a running joke on the pod, basically we call it hug me horror, which we feel like is kind of the prevailing sentiment these days, where everything, even a lot of horror, has to deal with grief and trauma and all this. Like, you know, you can't watch a Halloween Ends interview without Jamie Lee Curtis talking about how the movie's about COVID.
It's about trauma.
Yeah. We're just so tired of it. I mean, the whole metaphorical monster, I just like pine for the days of having like, I don't know, like a pumpkin head. It's like, give me a fucking
get it
creature
out
that
of my
walks on the
face.
ridge.
Give me a literal monster that bites your literal head off.
God, I just miss it so much. That's why I'm kind of excited for Hellraiser, but I'm just worried at the same time that at the end it's just like, well, actually, it was just, you know, it was my depression.
I worry about what today's TV writers will do with Hellraiser, but I'm gonna go in open-minded. So.
Well, they already changed the dang gender of Pinhead, so they've already committed violence to our shared cultural heritage.
Oh man, Matt, this is a blast. Thanks so much for talking to us about King. And
yes, always
yeah,
love to talk King.
It's great. And yeah, thanks so much for your time. And yeah, hope to cross paths with you again someday.
Certainly.
All
Bye-bye.
right, man. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I got some hot friends. God, I got some hot friends. I got some hot friends. God, I got some hot friends. But you know you want somebody to treat you good.
This is the end of our show. For now. Tune in next week. If you like our programming, consider searching for other bloody disgusting podcasts, such as Creepy, Horror Queers, The Boo Crew, SCP Archives, Nightlight, Margaret's Garden, and more.